fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. It's Wednesday, May 20th, and we are continuing our series on architecture in the time of coronavirus, trying to understand through diverse perspectives how our community is responding to these exceptional conditions. Today I'm talking to my longtime friend Nasser Rabbat, who's the Aga Khan Professor for Islamic Architecture at MIT. And I am talking to him about what he's hearing the best he can about the response to the virus in the communities of the Middle East. And I'm also talking to him about how he's responding to it in his personal life and in terms of how he's thinking about the post-colonial condition with all its complexities in relationship to the strangeness of our times. So, here's an introduction to the question of the post-colonial. I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. Welcome to Architecture Talk, Nasser. Such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Vikram. Thanks a lot, Vikram.
We have spent some time together, and as you were saying earlier, we have broken bread and shared salt.
Yes.
And hopefully a glass of wine or two. So
Indeed, and lots of quinoa in our case.
That's right, lots of quinoa on the high slopes of the Andes. How are you doing? How is the COVID isolation been treating you, and how are you coping?
Well, it's treating me relatively well, given how badly it is hitting communities that don't have the same kind of privileges that I have. So I don't have any existential problem, if you want, in relationship to COVID-19. I have more intellectual, perhaps actually political problems with the way the world is reacting to it, and the fact that we are, as a human community, unable to act responsibly in face of such a big challenge. So I'm actually thinking outside of the West, which is something that I always emphasize in talking to people or in my own writing, is that I find it extremely limiting when the reactions that we get when we speak to people about universal issues or universal problems, that they are focused only on what's happening in North America and Europe.
And in our sub-communities, we seem to think that the particular problems we have around our, very white neighborhoods, that somehow these are representative of the real difficulties that are being experienced by people.
Precisely. So, I mean, even if you want human compassion expressed through meetings with groups of friends or colleagues on Zoom, of course, now mostly, the compassion is always about problems which I think are somewhat trivial sometimes in relationship to what you read about poorer countries that have been hit hard, or poorer communities, as you were saying, even within our own affluent societies that have been hit hard.
But are you well in touch with communities in Syria, Egypt, Middle East? Like, tell us, what's going on?
Well, I'm in touch with communities that are like-minded and I would say like affluent. So I cannot really speak about the hard-hit communities. But I'm in touch with activists in places like Lebanon or Egypt, much less so in Syria and in Iraq for that matter. And of course, actually, the repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemics go way beyond the fact that it's hitting individuals, killing certain individuals, incapacitating others. But in these countries, it is actually aggravating pre-existing political problems. So in a country like Iraq, of course, you do have an extremely corrupt government or an extremely corrupt ruling class, and they are taking advantage of the situation. And the protests that were really about to reach a moment of serious influence on the direction of politics in Iraq, those were stopped, of course, because of the stay in place or shelter in place rule. The same for Lebanon, for example. Lebanon's economy is, as a matter of fact, disintegrating as we speak. And the political class, the sectarian political class that has caused it, is not being brought to accountability. And the people on the streets are very frustrated. Egypt is probably more like India in the sense of a strong government forcing a very poor population to abide by rules that are not explained to that population, nor what is the horizon of those new rules that are wreaking havoc in their economic well-being. Where is that going is not very clear to a lot of I would say, the working class people. But of course, actually, all of my information is filtered through individuals that share my background people who are trained in the West, who are extremely well educated, and who are more or less economically privileged. So it's all observational rather than more emotionally sharing in the kind of pain. And perhaps actually there's a little bit of detachment then in the kind of judgment, or perhaps even a political analysis level that has little to do with the actual problems and the actual pain on the ground of these communities, which I would even say that it applies also to the poorer communities or the more working class communities in our own neighborhoods.
This word that you use has stayed with me, struck me very strongly, the word detachment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I sense in that a sense of difficulty, not just distancing, a kind of a difficulty about our position, or the kind of white privilege position that you and I, people like you and me, sort of accede to without fully naturally belonging to, and the kind of voices and people that we aspire to speak for. Is that what you're talking about here?
It is. And it is something that, of course, precedes the COVID-19 crisis. And it has something to do with how people like us, I mean, a term that is, of course, much maligned today in the US, intellectuals. How do intellectuals relate to social problems, given the fact that in America, intellectuals translates mostly into academics, and the academic system in America, at least for those of us who are lucky enough to be able to go through its hoops, is a securing system. I mean, we are financially secure, and therefore, in a sense, we class-wise we belong to the other side than the one that we are trying to invigorate or empower.
Yes.
And that creates the detachment that I'm talking about, perhaps actually even a rupture, because our economic interests are on one side and our intellectual interests and intellectual commitments and political commitments are on the other side. And it seems to me that as a class, and I'm calling us now a class of intellectuals, public or actually very private, we are always trying to find a way to reconcile these two, or at least, and this is what I would call our liberal streak, if you want, of taking the economy out of the equation and claiming that it does not matter that we are secure economically. We can still feel the pain of those who are not secure economically. And it seems to me that there is a little bit of a paradox there that I really have no answer to or no solution to. That is, will I be, there are functionalist philosophers that would tell you in order for you to feel the pain of the poor, you have to experience poverty. Will I do that for myself? Probably not. And I would assume that none of us is willing to go all the way to saying that in order to be part some sort of the cause of the underprivileged, you have to experience underprivileged.
Yeah, I mean, that would be very difficult expectation of everyone. The other side to that is that there are two different vectors. On the one hand, there is the vector of empathy. Without empathy, there is no access to the other. I mean, and that's an important thing. You've got to be able to connect to people whose experience you have not personally had. But on the other hand, since you brought up that this is an old problem, there is also the problem of the old, let's say, post-colonial problem of wanting to have access to privilege precisely because you come from a long history of being denied it.
Mm-hmm.
Correct?
Yes.
So, which is also not to be faulted, really, or is it to be faulted?
And I am not at all in the business of pointing fingers. What I'm trying to convey in here is the perplexity of the paradox in which people who are in two different and in many instances antagonistic spheres of belonging, how do you bring these two together? So to avoid going back to the notion of the haves and the have-nots, go into a topic that you and I are more interested in, which is the colonial and the colonizers and the colonized,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that a class of the colonized used the tools of the colonizers in order to reassert a certain separation between the colonized and the colonizers.
Mm-hmm.
Those tools are never without a price. So the class that has used those tools found itself getting closer and closer mentally, behaviorally, and perhaps perceptually to the colonizers. And
Right.
how do you resolve this dilemma in your life? That is, we do acknowledge and recognize and want to use the tools of the colonizers, and we consider them to be universal tools. Modernity is the word that comes to mind, of course, in this relationship. Mm-hmm. But how do you avoid being identified or being separated from the colonized and being more and more identified with the colonizer? It's the same thing as to how do you separate from the haves and be able to be identified with the have-nots without ceasing to be a member of the haves.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I remember Spivak once talking about recognizing your privilege as loss. You remember that old
Yes.
phrase of hers.
Yeah.
And you are accurately and I think correctly describing it as a dilemma. A dilemma in the sense that it's not a black and white choice and you can say good versus evil. It's a dilemma precisely because it is a kind of a double bind that you can't easily undo. And that's in a sense the description of the condition of the sort of life that we find ourselves in. And I know you work on many things, but some of the things that you work on is still interrogating and reading, of course, Edward Said's work and Orientalism and its continuing thing. And within this, you are very interested in the project, as the Aga Khan professor of Islamic Architecture at MIT, in the articulation of what the Islamic history is, not from a narrow perspective, but from a very, I think, interesting, expansive perspective. But using the armature we have already set down.
Yes.
You have written here The Hidden Hand, Edward Said's Orientalism in Architectural History. I think it was published in JSA in December 2018.
Mm-hmm.
A kind of a field note. It says field note. Interesting. I like that. I like that phrase.
Because it was commissioned. Because it was a commissioned piece.
A commissioned piece. Some notes from the field. It feels anthropological, kind of like a diary from the front line.
Yeah, I mean, I could have said notes from the trenches even, actually, there.
World War I reference.
Yeah.
The trenches nowadays are our living rooms, though. We must not forget that.
Yes, but actually the trenches before that, I mean, since you are speaking about Edward Said, were our classrooms.
From our classrooms, and I like that. So one of these dilemmas, this sort of double binds, if you like, is the question of nationalism, right? And you have pulled up this fantastic quote by Edward Said, which you cite as one of your favorite quotes by Edward Said, not from Orientalism, but actually from Culture and Imperialism, one of his other books, that the nationalist ended up constructing and categorizing the history of quote unquote their architecture and of quote unquote their culture in general from an exclusive and ultimately narrowly defined national, religious, or cultural perspective. And I deeply resonate with that. As you know, I come from a strongly Nehruvian nationalist background. I've been born and brought up in Chandigarh, a highly publicized national modernist project. And when I think of that, I think of Nehru, and I always think of Nehru's great connection with Nasser, the other Nasser.
Yes.
Other Nasser Rabbat.
After whom I was named, by the way.
After whom you were named. But he had a single B, no? Or did he have two B's in his last name?
No, I mean, it doesn't really matter. In Arabic, it's the same spelling.
It's the same thing, yes.
I mean, his first name is Jamal.
Jamal, that's right.
And his last name is Abd al-Nasir, which actually is a very Egyptian last name, even though it means the same across the Arab world, because al-Nasir is one of the attributes of God, because Nasir means the bringer of victory, or victor, if you want. But al-Nasir, al is the definitive article in Arabic. So it means the only one that brings victory, which means God. And Abd means servant or slave. So his real name is Jamal, the slave of the bringer of victory. But because everyone started calling him Nasser as a much more invigorating word, if you want, when pan-Arabists across the Arab world wanted to feel some sort of an emotional or spiritual connection to him, they started calling their sons either Jamal or Nasser. So there are so many Nassers in my generation and so many Jamals. I was born when he nationalized the Suez Canal, which was seen as one of the most challenging and the most daring anti-colonial acts.
Absolutely. It's a landmark event in Nasser's history, in modern Egyptian history, and in the sort of inscription of third world identity as sort of wresting power away from the colonial moorings and into the new aspirations of the nation state.
And he was extremely, of course, influential, because, I mean, I come from Syria, not from Egypt, and I had a Lebanese mother and a Syrian father, and both of them were pan-Arabist. And to them, Nasser of Egypt was the symbol of the possibility of the Arabs to rise from their post-colonial or colonial and early post-colonial stupor, and that he was bringing in the idea or the ideal of how we can rise together as one large people. Of course, actually, that ideal was destroyed very quickly. And the funny thing is that my mom and dad, who were very staunchly supportive of the union between Syria and Egypt in 1958, when I was 2 years old, and both of them were public figures at the time. My mom and dad both were lawyers, but they were taking part in the public life through organizations, NGOs, and stuff like that. The two of them, by 1960, have changed their mind and started seeing Nasser for the dictator that he turned out to be. And so later in my life, I asked my mom, why did you name me Nasser after Abdel Nasser? And she said, no way, it wasn't Abdel Nasser. We weren't influenced by Abdel Nasser. We didn't like Abdel Nasser. We named you after after other Nassers in Islamic history. So Saladin or Salah ad-Din is actually, his title is also Al-Nasir. So my mom said, we named you after Salah ad-Din. And I said, come on. I mean, whose legs are you pulling in here? But what I'm trying to say is that that generation, and perhaps actually the same applies to the generation of your parents, who were very hopeful with the liberation and unification and modernization project of those historical leaders that appeared in the late 40s, early 50s, very quickly lost faith in that kind of regime because either of the corruption or the turn towards dictatorship or towards despotism that many of these countries have experienced. And I would say Abdel Nasser, in the last 10 years of his life, was more a despot than a national hero.
Why did that happen? Was the nation state project as such a problem as I think Saeed is trying to imply? I mean, the nationalist project with its accompanying production of new hegemonies and fictions of nationalist literatures, nationalist cultures, nationalist architectures, and so on and so forth, which was done extensively. Mm-hmm. Even if sort of coded through, more, if you want, universal or westernized institutions like modernism. Was the nation state, the post-colonial nation state, the problem, or was, in your view, the problem the corruptions of that state?
I think in a structural way, it is possible to compare what I was speaking about earlier to the problem of the nation state. I don't think the nation state is the problem, but I think it's the detachment or the distinction or even perhaps the antagonism between the two ideals of a nation state that could build its own identity and culture and history and so on, which is a project that has not yet been defeated, to tell you the truth. It is still there. Mm-hmm. And of course, its problems historically is that perhaps there is no correspondence between geography and history in the definition of the nation state in many of these nation states, because they are the result of a recession of a colonial authority that redivided the colonized lands in ways that may not have respected the correspondence between geography and history. But that's not the detachment that I'm talking about. The detachment is between the ideal of the nation state, which requires a certain level of perhaps abstraction in thinking and in action, and the much more still pre-modern politics of the ruling classes of those nation states. That is, we had a modern nation, but we did not have a modern national leader or modern national leaders. We had pre-modern tribal national leaders for an ideal that requires a certain level of abstraction and a certain level of generalization and a detachment from the notion of depending on your tribe or your sect or your religion or whatever it is that you use in order to establish your authority, and starting to see the nation state as a place for all of its citizens. The problem is not with the ideal of the nation state, but is of the difficulty, perhaps actually even the impossibility, of overlaying the pre-modern politics on the modern notion of the nation state.
I mean, I also remember Nehru describing Chandigarh's genesis. One of his famous quotation is that this is to be a city unfettered from the past. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he often talked about the necessity of liberating architecture and the modern Indian citizen from the shackles of, let's say, in your words, tribal mentalities.
Yeah? Yes.
Yeah. So this is so in one sense, it's a sort of a double-edged direction I want to take this. Is often one hears a critique of this position as, well, yeah, that's exactly what the colonists also used to say. You have read Dipesh Chakrabarti and how they said we have to be in the waiting house of history until we are civilized enough, let's say abstracted enough to be able to access to modernity. And once we are modern enough, we will do modernity. And one can say that is a residual neo-colonialist position. I'd be interested in your response to that. But I'm also interested in the alternate direction question, which is that now we talk about alt-modernities. We talk about other modernities that were sort of washed out in the kind of flood of Eurocentric modernism, which you and I acceded to and participated in happily, as did Nasser and Nehru and so on and so forth, as your parents did, my parents did. So, but we talk about the other modernities that did not happen and perhaps could have happened. And I think you allude to that a little bit also when you talk about the Islamic project, right? I mean, the unfinished kind of Islamic project in your writings as something that both has to resist a kind of a stereotyping that Said warned about, and yet has to maintain that alt position to come to another horizon of possibility in the future, right? I mean, this is how I'm reading it. So what do you think about that? And is modernity, in this sense, an Islamic modernity or a South Asian or post-colonial modernity, is it an unfinished project or is it a dead project?
These are way too large questions for me to actually say that I can claim any authority in answering them. But I want to start from another quotation of Nehru, since Nehru is I mean, the most famous quotation of him is about India being a palimpsest.
Yes, yes.
And everyone uses it, and I'm using it actually in a book that I'm editing on Syria, because I want to claim that Syria is the same. And this would be the introduction to my answer. Perhaps a little bit tangential, but nonetheless, it can convey a little bit of what I'm thinking of as the possibility not of an alternative modernity, but of a shared modernity. So my scholarly work, of course, actually I have many directions, and I'm by training more of a medievalist. So my interests lie in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century. But my if one would say my passionate scholarly work, if you want, is improving the palimpsest quality of all regions that claim cultural production, whether you would call them a nation or an empire or a sultanate or whatever you want to call them. But what I'm interested in is in proving two things. One is the notion that there is no pure producer of culture, that we cannot claim Indian culture to be the product of whoever you're going to call the Indians, the pure Indians, if you want, nor can we claim that there is a trajectory of civilization that is only the result of one cultural region's work, namely that Europe is the heir of classicism, and therefore Europe can claim that descent that brings it down to a modernity that is in more ways than one connected to the classical way of thinking, to the philosophy, to the art, to the aesthetics, to whatever it is of the ancient Greeks. So I work on two levels, and that article of Edward Said is only on the level of insisting that any division is artificial by nature, because all divisions have more than one actor. So it's very difficult to purify a division and say this is ontologically a representative only of that one element. But the other that I work on is to actually share the genealogy or share the heritage. So one of my main areas of research is how Islamic art and architecture, but in general Islamic thinking, is very much a descendant, a conscious descendant of classicism. So that you deny the West its monopoly of the heritage of classicism, which is necessary for the definition of modernity. If you say that there are more descendants to this idea than the ones that claim to be carrying that heritage and shaping it in the form of modernity today, then modernity has to open up and becomes shared rather than alternative. I appreciate and I respect the work of people who are looking for other ways of defining modernity, but I actually want to open the boundaries of the modernity that we today call Eurocentric and make it less Eurocentric by proving that it owes a lot to that idea of palimpsest, that idea of so many contributors, and some of these contributors are decolonized. And also the colonized are the heirs of the cultures that the modern Europeans are claiming to be their heritage.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more, Nasser. I mean, that's a very good point. Bringing in this, the idea of the palimpsest as not only the description of India, but indeed of the whole world, and kind of the modalities or the forces that run through the palimpsest as events that happen, have always happened and continue to happen today across regions, cultures, and supposed identities and nations. And in this sense, it is also the way I would put it is designed to liberate the West from its own ghosts as well.
Of course,
it's self-created mythologies of singularity, which is a burden for them. You know, I mean, they should happily be able to wear an Indian kurta pajama and claim it as their own.
Precisely, which actually, I mean, given the fact of the inequality of the power between different cultural zones today, they can do it much easier than when you and I wear our Yapani pantaloon as that famous song.
Mera juta hai Japani.
Yeah. So it seems to me that it will widen their horizons as much as it will widen our horizons, because as you see in both India and the Islamic world today, one of the more persistent and perhaps pervasive reaction to that claim of monopoly on modernity by the West is a hardening of positions and the rise of nativist ideologies that are saying we are separate, we are different. So in a sense, the work on breaking the exclusivity or the Western exclusivity of modernity is a liberating action for both the West, and it's actually a way of saying you are much more universal or global than you give yourselves credit for, and at the same time is to react to those forces of insularity that are rising in our parts of the world, and to say we never were that. As a matter of fact, actually, my opponents are both the Eurocentrics and the fundamentalist or traditionalist or nativist Islamicist or Hinduist or whatever you want to call them in the formerly colonized world, because again of what you are referring to in here is that everything should be shared because everything was produced in a shared manner. And of course, everyone recognizes that. I mean, how can you understand mathematics without the contribution of the old Indian mathematics? And how did it come to the attention of those who are going to develop it in the 18th century? Through who? What other cultures have contributed to it? So to me, it's not just basically that notion of saying that, hey, my culture is great because we contributed this or we did this or we did that. But it's actually the notion of that interconnectedness that has existed all along. So I think actually you said Spivak, and I mean a lot of the post-colonial or so-called post-colonial thinkers coming from South Asia, they all are aware of that evasiveness or porosity of boundaries in the modern period. I, as someone who is a pre-modern historian, I want to actually push it back in time. Yeah. I want to speak about porosity across history so that no one can claim cultural possession at any point without recognizing that in order for this, whatever product it is, to get into your hand and for you to perfect it or to embellish it or to produce the most beautiful Gothic cathedrals out of it, there are so many other cultures, so many other histories that have contributed to it until it got into your hands.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the Mamluks, or whatever you are defining as your 12th to 14th century history, things that the slave. We were taught them as the slave dynasties.
That's a British name that I would like to reject.
Okay, fine.
It's like the mutiny of 1856, by the way. I challenge my South Asian students all the time. What happened in 1856 in India? And anyone who says mutiny, I jump on them.
Yeah. Well, we have this whole history of the Mamluk influence in India, at least during that period. And all these people who were, former slaves who became kings and so on and so forth. I'm interested in what you started to say. So articulate for me, let's say, an example or two of this kind of a, I don't know what the phrase, global cosmopolitan world of the 13th, 14th century from your perspective.
I'm going to use a few examples, but I'm going to start by one of my favorite books of an Indian author, for that matter, and that is Amitav Ghosh.
Okay.
I don't know if you have read his book called In an Antique Land.
I have it. I have not read it, though. Yeah.
So Amitav Ghosh, this is an old book of Amitav Ghosh. Yeah. He became much more Indo-centric, if you want, later. But this is a book in which Amitav Ghosh is the epitome of what I'm talking about, of sort of like a cosmopolitan culture even before the modern period. So Amitav Ghosh, I don't know if you know that, but was a reader in Arabic in England. Yeah. And he studied Islamic history for reasons that are totally unclear to me now. And his professor from either Oxford or Cambridge sent him to Egypt to study Arabic. And Amitav Ghosh decided instead of going to the metropolis, he was going to go to some sort of a village to learn Arabic there. So he lived in a village, and he lived in conditions that were very similar to the very deprived conditions of an Indian village. And in his mind, he was comparing between the project of modernity, this thing is happening in the 60s and Nasser was still alive, and what the Nehruvian project in India and the Nasserist project in Egypt, and the fact that it's not touching everyone equally, and that there were still people in villages that are living an extremely underprivileged life. So that's part of his book. But his book ultimately is because he is researching this archive that was discovered, and start seeing with me now the globalism, was uncovered in a synagogue in the old city of Cairo that had all the documents that had the word God on them, because observing Jews do not throw paper that has the word of God on it. Oh. In order to actually get rid of these papers, you bring them to the synagogue, where every couple of years the rabbi would perform a certain rituals, and then they are buried or gotten rid of, but you have to desacralize them. So for a reason that is not clear until now, the Jewish community of Fustat, which is the city south of Cairo, between around the year 900 and the year 1200, gave all of these papers to that synagogue, but the succession of rabbis failed to perform the rituals, and they stored all of these papers in one room that was walled off later on and uncovered only in 1910 or thereabout.
Huh.
So suddenly we have all of the legal documents of the Jewish community of Cairo for 3 centuries. And these legal documents are about rent and sales and buying and everything, and also, of course, few incantations and prayers and so on. But a lot of them are just legal, about who married whom and who divorced whom and who died and how much of his money went to his sons or daughters, and on and on and on. And of course, actually, so and so, the Jewish landlord rented 2 apartments, one to a Coptic Christian and one to a Muslim. So you have now the names of the Coptic and the Muslim, and the fact that they lived in a building that was owned by a Jew and so on. I mean, all of these little historical nuggets. But what Amitav Ghosh was interested in was a woman of Indian origin that appears in some of these documents, who's appearing only as a number and who's clearly a Hindu. We are around the year 1000, and who is married to a Jewish trader from Fustat, whose family sent him to be on the Malabar coast as their representative. And he produces from her 2 kids, a son and a daughter. And he, as an observant Jew, is very concerned about the fact that his son and daughter are not going to be considered Jewish. Right. So Amitav is following how this father manages to include his progeny in the Jewish community. He brings back the Indian woman with him to Fustat, and his daughter is married to a Jew trader in Palermo, Sicily, and his son ends up, I don't know where, let's say, for example, in Iraq or something like that. We are in the year 1000. We have someone who acquires an Indian slave, becomes the mother of his kids. His kids are all over. The guy is sent by his family to India and to come back to Adan in Yemen, and then from there back to Fustat. And it's clear that they have family representative in Palermo. Otherwise, how could a Jew of Palermo know about his daughter and marry her? Yeah. So what Amitav Ghosh is actually drawing, and very beautifully doing it, by the way, is by tracking the life of this one Indian woman and humanizing this one Indian woman through the Geniza. They're called the Geniza, which actually is the same word in Arabic today for the funeral, Janaza or Genaza. So in Hebrew,
we call it Janaza, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So in the Hebrew, Geniza is actually this collection of papers that are waiting to be funerally discarded because they have the word God on them. That's why we call this whole cache of paper. But Amitav Ghosh showed us that Cairo was a center of a trade, a global trade that connected India to Europe in the period that I'm interested in. And the implication of that is that we really don't know much about these individuals. But imagine, in one family, we have now one in Iraq, one in Italy, one in Egypt, one in Yemen, and one in India.
Mm-hmm. There you are.
Exactly. So this is
that's like us today, man, you and me.
Precisely.
I'm married to a half Italian American whose family hails from Sicily and southern Italy. Half her family, other half comes from, I don't know, some English German blood, and North Indian. So it's this sort of cosmopolitanism.
Absolutely. Well, I'm married to a half German, half Egyptian. So, I mean, we're also in the same boat in that sense. And that is the cosmopolitanism that I want to revive an awareness of it, so that the word cosmopolitanism is not monopolized by the definition of the colonial officer cosmopolitan who travels around the world. That there were other forms of cosmopolitan life that existed, and actually there are even claims that they were much more peaceful than the cosmopolitan that comes on the tail end of a colonial conquest. Mm-hmm. These were not conquests. I mean, for centuries, India traded with the Arabs and the East Africans without any side trying to conquer the other side. It wasn't until the Portuguese came in that we saw a change in the trade relationship in India.
Right. I mean, I think, the sort of cosmopolitanism of today carries with it the charge of epistemic and real violence, because it comes on the infrastructure of universalism and universal rights and, that kind of things. Whereas I think the kind of cosmopolitanism that you are describing and that we are quite familiar with is much more of a persistently negotiated kind of a system in which the network has to be constantly and repeatedly renegotiated, and that renegotiation reforms but also strengthens the network, right? I mean, those are sort of related but slightly different entities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it seems to me that there are two ways, and unfortunately, the two ways have collapsed into one recently, but there are two ways of exchange, of global exchange. And one of them is let's call it the negotiated, but it could be, you could call it the commercial or the mercantile one. And the other is the conquest, is the idea of like, in order for me to know you, I have to somehow control you. There is an idea of like, I want to know you through basically finding common interest with you, whatever that common interest is, whether it is mercantile or intellectual. Because I'm also reminded, and this is the other side of my answer to you, why I'm interested and what is interesting about the period that I study, the Mamluk period. Cairo, and to a lesser extent my own native city of Damascus, become centers of Islamic learning in the Mamluk period. For reasons that I don't want to elaborate upon now, the Mamluks put so much money in establishing learning centers that we call madrasas. And this is the period in which Cairo acquires something around 500 madrasas. I want you to imagine that what we're talking about is like 500 small colleges, and Damascus may be about 100 of them. So ulama, scholars, flock into these two cities from everywhere in the Islamic world. And for those of us who are interested in that period, if you take biographical dictionaries, and they produced a huge amount of biographical dictionaries in that period, and you see the toponym of the ulama, of the scholars, they're from everywhere. They are from China, from Central Asia, from different parts of India. So you have them with all the last names. So you have the Gujarati and the Dukkani and the Delhi, and I mean, they come with those names. And there are professors in colleges in Egypt. Right. And you have the Takruri and the Sudani and God knows what from Mali and Sudan and Ethiopia also coming in there. And of course, actually, you have the Turks and the Iranians of all of their colors, and of course, all the Arabs and the North Africans.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's amazing. And that reminds me of the great universities of Nalanda and so on in India from the 5th to the 12th century, which had people from certainly a lot of traffic from Afghanistan, China, Tibet, all over India, South Asia, Southeast Asia. But I would imagine, I haven't studied them in that great detail, but I would imagine also from West Asia and those parts of the world.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
Similarly, yeah.
I mean, you have the people that you call the Christian Syrians in India, and that's not
a long time ago. Yes.
Yeah. And that's not
that's from the 2nd century.
Exactly. So that's not a name that comes out of nothing.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I want to go back to the abstraction that I'm working on. This is not sort of like, I mean, of course, my scholarly work is about specific episodes of what I'm describing, but my conceptual work is about opening up the definition across time to include all sorts of exercises of what we today give a conceptual name to under the form of cosmopolitanism, which is a higher level of being a modern individual, and showing that cosmopolitanism comes in all shapes and forms, but it still is cosmopolitanism. So I don't want it to say there is an alternative cosmopolitanism. I want the rigid definition of cosmopolitanism today to be open to include all of these. So this is why I'm saying it's partaking in the definition of modernity. It's partaking in the definition of cosmopolitanism. It's partaking in the definition of multiculturalism, of interculturalism, of plurality, and so on. So that's why the word palimpsest was very helpful even though I'm using it in a way different than perhaps the Nehruvian aim was to actually say that we are a collection of so many cultures and so on, but we are going to be now joined by that new national feeling of being Indians, regardless of where we came from or who we are or what is our culture or our religion. To me, it is the national project is of less interest than the project of partaking of what makes us contemporary and what makes us, for the lack of a better word, humanistic. I am still somewhat of a stickler to a purer definition of humanism of 18th century, even though a lot of critical writing has sort of like denigrated it or denied it its claim of transcendence. To me, this is really the aim of my life work, is to challenge the boundaries of contemporary terms by showing their historicity or their historical longue durée, and by showing their cultural multiplicity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm totally eager student of this work with you. I read it, I'm with you, and I cannot wait for it. But as we move to the end and conclude over here, I sometimes wonder if this isn't in some ways, self-serving for us. I mean, I'm completely with you. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I look at all the rise of this sort of new rise of all the nationalisms and parochialisms, here in the United States, in England, in India, in the Middle East, everywhere. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Maybe we are missing something.
Oh, maybe we want to miss that something. If you are a firm believer in the diversity of the human race, it seems to me that you also have to accept the fact that we're not going to necessarily agree as a group of people on ideals. We might have different ideals. I feel that the best thing that we could hope for is to have a marketplace of ideas where everyone is actually pushing for the idea that they feel is, if you want, the better idea for the time or for the circumstances. So I am not pushing for a better definition of nationalism. Maybe other people are. Is it self-serving? Of course it is. I mean, we are the residual expatriates. We are, if you want, the people that somehow symbolize the notion that belonging to a place could be an ephemeral component of who you are, or it could be, again, a function of memory more so than a function of actual engagement and active engagement with belonging to the place. So even if the Arab world is the subject of my interest, I am not part of the Arab world. I'm actually trying to make that my interest a part of a larger interest. So part of my work is to perhaps scholarly be meticulous about the periods and the places and the people and the monuments that I'm studying. But the other is to be able to abstract it, and I would not deny the self-serving aspect of it in here, abstract it to the level of a human level, of a level of an interest, because of what it contributes to the larger ideas or to the larger principles that we were talking about. So there is a little bit of a utopianism in there, which counter the self-interest. And as I started my conversation with you today, I am very well aware of my personal and my class interest in everything that I do. And I mean, I don't know if it's, how should I say, remedy enough to acknowledge it. But to me, I stopped there. I would not claim to be something other than what I am. And what I am, of course, is someone that has individual interests and class interests and group interests. And hopefully, which is what I probably have been laughed at because I've really clung to it, I am still very much interested in the human level.
Well, human to human, Nasser, such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Vikram. I very much appreciate the kind of depths that you took the conversation to.
Wonderful.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thank you again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.